Hi, dear friends, some words of Torah for Parshat Pinchas. The Gordian knot is a term to describe a seemingly unsolvable problem that is resolved by someone ingenious who figures out a solution that is innovative yet simple, such that no one thought to do it before him. The term is based on a legend dating back to the 3rd or 4th century before the Common Era. An ancient people living in the city of Gordium, and their monarchy was signified by an ox cart tied with a very intricate knot to a post. An oracle had declared that any man who could unravel its elaborate knots was destined to become a ruler of all of Asia. A young man named Alexander struggled to untie the knot without success. He then reasoned that it would make no difference how the knot was loosed, so he drew his sword and sliced it in half with a single stroke. Many interpretations of the story have been offered, but not all of them are complementary to Alexander the Great. On the one hand, he solved the riddle in an innovative fashion. On the other hand, he applied brute force to a problem that others had tried to solve with more elegance and refinement. One might argue that this was an impossible situation and that brute force was the only solution. At the same time, one could also argue that if the only path to becoming Persian emperor is through violence, maybe it's not worth it. Or perhaps Alexander could have become an even greater ruler if only he had exercised more forethought to the Gordian knot problem. Maybe with a bit more patience, he would have solved the problem without resorting to brute force. In our Parsha, we read about a similar Gordian knot. The Jews were dying in a plague. Pinchas realized that it was due to a sinful act that was being perpetrated publicly, and that no one else was able to solve the problem. He came forward with his spear and used a Gordian knot solution. He succeeded through violence, killing Zimri and Cozbi publicly, and the plague stopped. Hashem praised Pinchas as being the one who was able to stay the plague. But was it the best solution? Was it the solution that others could and should have resorted to? Why was only Pinchas the one who seized the moment? The Torah describes the powerlessness of Moshe and the elders by stating in last week's portion, Vehema bochim petach ohel moed. They were crying at the entrance of the Mishkan. Why were they crying? And why is it important to know that they were crying right in front of the Mishkan? It may have to do with the moral dilemma that they were facing. Sometimes the cure is worse than the illness. At times, in order to solve a problem, you must resort to an act that will dehumanize you in the process. Here we are, a holy people who are connected to God, signified by the Mishkan in our midst. We know that the way to stay the plague is to eliminate the evil in our midst. But eliminating the evil requires us to unleash violence on one of our own tribal princes. Is it worth it? Pinchas concluded that it was. He believed that despite the callousness that would result from the violence, Bnei Yisrael would recover their refinement through our holy Torah. But it wasn't so simple, and that is why Moshe and the elders were paralyzed by the moral conundrum. There's an interesting parallel between two biblical stories. Hashem declared in our Parsha that Pinchas heshiv et chamati. Through his zealotry, he succeeded in abating my anger. There's another story of anger abatement through an act of violence in the story of Purim. Once Esther exposed Haman as the man who would try and murder her, Achashverosh flew into a rage. A man named Charvona, an officer of the king's court, was present. Charvona observed that there was a tree in Haman's own backyard that had been designated for Mordechai's gallows. Achashverosh ordered Haman to be hanged on those very gallows, and the king's anger was abated. A number of holy Sfarim, quoting the Arizal, state that numerically Charvona can be equated to Pinchas Eliyahu when you put those two names together, in that Charvona was either a reincarnation or some other spiritual continuation of Pinchas, who would later change his identity and become Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. This is rooted in the long-standing Midrashic tradition that Pinchas and Eliyahu are one and the same person. Our sages in Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer indicate that at the moment Charvona spoke, it really wasn't Charvona, it was really Elijah masquerading as Charvona. The Radal says that this is why on Purim night, right after reading the Megillah, We praise and curse all the major characters of the story, Esther, Mordechai, Haman, and Zeresh, in the Shoshanat Yaakov hymn, but we finish the song with the words, V'gam Charvona Zachur Latov. The only other person who was known as Zachur Latov, may he be remembered for the good, is Eliyahu Hanavi. Coincidence? No. This is because at that moment Charvona was Eliyahu. He was actually a combination of both Pinchas and Eliyahu. He recommended solving the Haman problem through violence, like Pinchas, but instead of meting out the violence himself, he used speech, like Eliyahu, to bring about resolution. Elijah accomplished a tremendous amount in his lifetime as a prophet and leader of Israel, but his past as Pinchas was marked by an act of violence. The reason why his name changed to Eliyahu is because he needed a makeover. He had to redo himself and his persona from the violent Pinchas and change his identity to a person of peace and mainstream leadership. This could also be one reason why Eliyahu alone is identified by the words Zachur Latov, may he be remembered for the good. That means that there were parts of his life that weren't so pretty and elegant. When he was Pinchas and when he was Elijah at certain junctures, when he was overly zealous and proclaimed the famine in the land, which is in the story in the first book of Kings, chapter 17, he wasn't living his greatest moments. Despite the rationale for zealotry, when we think of Eliyahu, we remember him as the harbinger of peace and the Messianic age. We therefore say, Zachur Latov, may he be remembered for the latter instead of the former, only the good part. We do not minimize the great that Pinchas accomplished. He saved Jewish lives, and it was his love of the Jewish people that forced him to do what he felt needed to be done at great personal sacrifice, in that he allowed himself to commit a violent act against a brother, something from which he would normally have recoiled. He was greatly rewarded as being granted the gift of the kahuna, because so greatly did he display his love for his fellow Jew. But because he did so through an act of violence, he had to eventually change his identity to become Eliyahu Hanavi. Sometimes doing the right thing requires us to apply brute force, angry rhetoric, and even violence in order to protect and save the Jewish people. But afterwards, we need a makeover to convert the Pinchas into Eliyahu. There is no question that Israel was put in that similar impossible situation after October 7th. Had we not acted with decisive violence, Israel's very existence would have been in jeopardy. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. Once all our hostages are returned and Hamas is eliminated entirely, it will be time for Pinchas to become Eliyahu. May we all merit to hear that voice of peace very soon, dear friends. Bimheira b'yameinu amen. Here's wishing you a beautiful Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. Have a meaningful period of Bein HaMitzarim. All the best.